He said nothing. Not when they stopped him, not when they cuffed him in front of strangers, and not when the white judge slammed the gavel and sent him straight to jail. They thought he was just another quiet black man, powerless, alone. But Malik Carter wasn't just anyone. He's the son of the state's governor, and he was never alone. He was waiting, watching, letting them expose themselves. What happens when the system tries to break a man without realizing he holds the power to break it back? Like, share, and subscribe. Because this silence, it's about to make the whole courtroom scream. Let's begin. It happened on a Wednesday morning, quiet as most small-town mornings go. The sun wasn't quite high yet, the sky still holding on to that soft gray haze before heat sets in. Malik Carter stood alone near a worn-down bench at a rural bus stop off Highway 74 just outside of Mason County. He had on a plain light blue shirt, sleeves rolled, collar unbuttoned, and a leather backpack that looked like it had followed him for years. Nothing flashy, nothing threatening. Just a man waiting for a ride. There wasn't anyone else around at first except for two older white folks sitting at the far end of the bench, a man in overalls, a woman with a folded newspaper on her lap. They glanced at Malik once, maybe twice, didn't say a word. The patrol car rolled in slow like it had nowhere else to be. Officer Chad Doyle pulled up alongside the curb engine still running and stepped out with the kind of posture that told you he thought this stop was necessary, even if no law had been broken. Doyle wasn't new. Everyone around town knew him, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, quick to squint and quicker to judge. He didn't start with a greeting, just walked up, rested one hand casually near his holster and said, "Got some ID on you." The tone wasn't polite. It wasn't curious. It was sharp, like he was already preparing for a problem. Malik looked at him calm as ever, then slowly reached for the front pocket of his backpack. That pause, that measured, careful movement was all it took for Doyle to decide he was being disrespected. "What's the holdup?" Doyle snapped. Not trying to cooperate. Malik said nothing. He kept his eyes on Doyle, not hostile, not pleading, just steady. His silence wasn't nervous. It wasn't confused. It was something else. And that something rubbed Doyle the wrong way. To him, silence meant challenge. It meant this man, this young black man, thought he could just stand there, look him in the eye, and not jump when told. Doyle's jaw clenched. His voice turned from suspicion to authority. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Malik didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He turned slow and deliberate. Doyle pulled the cuffs from his belt like he'd been waiting all morning to use them. The click of metal locking over Malik's wrists echoed louder than it should have in that open parking lot. The two older folks watched, stunned but silent. The man stood up halfway like he might say something, then thought better of it. The woman looked away, folding her paper tighter. No one spoke. No one asked questions. And no one pulled out a phone. Malik was walked to the back of the patrol car, not dragged, not pushed. But each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of something unseen had settled on the moment. He got in without resistance, didn't even glance back. From the outside, it might have looked routine. A black man stopped and cuffed because he didn't show ID fast enough. No yelling, no violence, nothing flashy enough to go viral. But for anyone paying close attention, there was something off, something wrong. Maybe it was the way Doyle's voice never matched the calmness of Malik's silence. Maybe it was the way Malik carried himself, not like someone caught doing something wrong, but like someone letting something unfold. There was no fear in his face, no confusion, just a quiet knowing, like a man watching a script play out that he'd read 100 times before. That's what made it unsettling. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even trying to stop it. It felt like the kind of moment that slips through unnoticed, that doesn't make headlines, doesn't spark outrage, because on paper it's nothing more than a simple arrest. But if you were standing there, if you saw the way Malik moved, the way he didn't resist, didn't explain, you'd feel it too. This wasn't a man caught off guard. This was a man who knew exactly what was coming, and he let it happen. Not because he was weak, because he was waiting. And whatever he was waiting for, it hadn't happened yet. But it was coming. And for those of us watching, even from the outside looking in, we couldn't help but feel that something had just been set in motion. Something quiet, Something powerful. Something that wouldn't stay silent for long. By morning, word had already spread around the courthouse that a young black man had been arrested at the bus stop just outside town. No one knew exactly what he'd done. No one really cared to ask. All they needed to hear was that he didn't cooperate, and that was enough. The courthouse was small. No marble pillars, no media cameras, just worn tile floors, creaky wooden benches, and a judge's bench that looked like it hadn't been polished in 20 years. The kind of courtroom where everyone knows everyone, and silence isn't about respect, it's about who's watching. That morning, the room filled quickly. Mostly older white faces. Local farmers, shop owners, clerks who took an early break just to see what the fuss was about. There was a certain hush in the air, not from reverence, but from curiosity, the kind you hear when people come not for justice, but for spectacle. When Malik was led into the courtroom, still in the same clothes from yesterday, hands cuffed, no expression on his face, you could feel the shift. Not panic, not surprise, just discomfort, like something didn't match. Some of the folks squinted. Others smirked. One woman whispered to her neighbor loud enough for the row to hear, "Bet he thought we wouldn't do anything." Another man folded his arms and muttered, "They always think they're smarter than the law." But Malik didn't look at them, not once. He kept his eyes forward, his posture straight as the bailiff guided him to the defendant's table. No lawyer sat beside him, no family in the back row. He sat alone. And not a single soul in that room seemed troubled by that. Judge Harold Brenner entered the room like a man walking into his living room. Everyone stood. He didn't acknowledge them, just nodded toward the clerk and sat down with a heavy sigh. 62, wide-framed and known throughout the county as a man who doesn't tolerate nonsense. Brenner had been on that bench longer than most people in the room had been paying taxes. His record wasn't spotless, but it was consistent. And for some people, that was enough. He glanced at the file in front of him, then looked up at Malik. "Name," he said. Malik said nothing. Brenner waited a beat, then looked at the bailiff. "You got a name on him?" Malik Carter, the bailiff, replied. Brenner raised an eyebrow and looked back at Malik. "Mr. Carter, this isn't some kind of performance art, is it? You understand you're in a court of law." Still no response. The judge leaned back in his chair, lips pressing together, trying to decide if this was stupidity or defiance. And then came the chuckle, that short, sharp exhale of contempt that only a man with unchecked authority could deliver. "Is this some kind of protest?" he said, voice louder now, "or are you just dumb?" A few people in the gallery laughed under their breath. One man snorted. Another leaned forward like he didn't want to miss whatever came next. But Malik didn't react. No shift in his seat. No dart of the eyes. He simply stared ahead, eyes fixed not on the judge, but somewhere past him. Like he wasn't in the room for them. Like he was waiting on something bigger. And that's when you felt it. It wasn't that Malik was afraid. He wasn't angry either. He wasn't calculating his next move. No, it was something quieter than that. More dangerous. He was watching, listening, measuring the room. Not as a man caught, but as a man who had predicted every moment of this. And Judge Brenner, in all his arrogance, didn't see it. He looked at Malik the way you look at a boy caught skipping school. As if this was just another correction to be handed down, another lesson to be taught. "Fine," he said, flipping a page in the file. "We'll set bail and move on. If he wants to sit there like a mute, let him. The court's not here to play games." But the court was playing one. It just didn't know it yet. And as Malik sat there, silent, unbothered, not even flinching when the gavel dropped, people in the courtroom started to shift in their seats, not from guilt, but from something else. Curiosity. They started to whisper less, to watch more closely, because deep down even the ones who came for the show began to wonder, who was this man who wouldn't speak? Why did he act like this was nothing new, and what exactly was he waiting for? No one had answers. Not yet. But every second that passed, it became harder to dismiss him as just another quiet defendant. There was something happening in that courtroom that morning. Something most of them didn't understand. But they could feel it. Like a storm building behind closed doors. Like a man they couldn't read who maybe could read all of them. And that more than anything was what made them uncomfortable. It had been nearly 20 minutes since Judge Brenner first opened the file. 20 minutes of routine procedure, half-mumbled legal jargon, and a string of dismissive remarks that barely veiled his disdain. He didn't need Malik to speak. He had already decided what kind of man he was dealing with. Quiet, stubborn, maybe slow, maybe dangerous, probably both. Malik hadn't flinched through any of it. He sat in that stiff-backed chair with his hands folded loosely in his lap, his eyes forward, his posture straight. He didn't look beaten. He didn't look proud either. He looked still, like someone preserving energy, like someone who had weathered far worse storms than this room could ever offer. But for Brenner, that stillness didn't feel like calm. It felt like disrespect. The judge was used to voices pleading, apologizing, lying. He knew how to read guilt, shame, arrogance, fear. But silence. Silence gave him nothing to grab hold of. It made him feel like he wasn't in control. And men like Brenner, they didn't tolerate that feeling for long. So he kept pushing. He poked at Malik's clothes, asking if he couldn't afford a belt. He made a crack about people who don't know how courtrooms work and shouldn't waste the court's time. He referred to him more than once as this defendant instead of his name. Still, Malik didn't blink. The courtroom, which had started the morning half curious and half dismissive, now leaned in just a little more. Even those who'd chuckled earlier weren't sure whether to laugh anymore. Something about the way this young man absorbed every insult without reaction, it was unsettling. And then Brenner snapped. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the sense that the room wasn't quite on his side anymore. Or maybe it was just that ugly, buried part of him, the part that had always believed a black man who didn't show deference needed to be reminded who held the gavel. He slammed a palm against the bench and stood. Say something, boy. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a demand. It was a dare. The kind of words that echo in old courtrooms and old stories and sometimes never leave. Malik finally lifted his head, and for the first time he looked directly at Judge Brenner. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't defiant. There was no heat in his eyes, just a quiet, measured weight. And then he spoke. 5 words. Calm, clear, unmistakable. I speak when it matters. The room froze. Not like before when people were simply waiting. This time they froze because they'd heard something they didn't expect and couldn't quite explain. It was the tone that hit first. Not loud, not angry, but the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to fill the room. The kind of voice that had already been heard before it left the lips. Then came the meaning. 5 words that said more than any defense could have. 5 words that weren't just a reply, they were a statement, a shift in the balance. A few people in the gallery turned toward each other, confused. Others stared at Malik like they were seeing him for the first time. One older man in the back row leaned forward, eyebrows drawn, as if trying to understand what he had just felt in his gut. A woman, black, maybe in her 40s, tightened her grip on her son's hand beside her. She didn't say anything, but her jaw locked, and her eyes narrowed like she'd seen this before, like she already knew where this story could go. Judge Brenner stood there for a moment, blinking. His face was red now, not from embarrassment, but from something deeper, something closer to rage. For a man who'd spent decades controlling rooms with just his voice being answered like that, being challenged so directly in front of a packed courtroom, it wasn't just disrespectful. It was dangerous, and he couldn't let it stand. So he didn't argue. He didn't respond. He just sat down slowly, picked up the gavel, and spoke into the silence like he was announcing the weather. 30 days, county jail, for contempt of court. The gavel came down harder than it needed to. Sharp, final, no room for protest, not that Malik offered one. The bailiff stepped forward. Malik rose to his feet, still silent, still composed, still looking ahead. And the moment he stepped away from the table, something shifted in the room. The quiet wasn't about fear anymore. It was about realization. This wasn't over. In fact, it hadn't even begun. What some had assumed was arrogance, others now began to see as control. What looked like weakness might have been strategy. And what everyone had taken as silence was starting to sound a lot more like warning. People didn't know who he was yet, but they would. That much was becoming clear. Because for all the talk, all the shouting, all the courtroom drama, they'd heard just one sentence from him, and it was enough to change the air in the room. It was enough to make them sit back and think, Who is this man, and what exactly is he waiting for? They brought him in late near sundown when the hallway lights buzzed softly overhead, and most of the noise had already settled into that familiar low hum of routine. The air inside the county jail felt stale and indifferent, like it had seen too much, and no longer cared to remember. Sergeant Emily Ward stood at the intake desk, flipping through paperwork, not expecting anything unusual. But then she looked up. He walked in slowly, without resistance, his wrists cuffed but his back straight. No shouting, no stalling, no trace of panic in his eyes. Just calm. The kind of calm you don't expect from someone sentenced on the spot by a small-town judge. His name came across her clipboard, Malik Carter. 30 days for contempt of court. No bail, no lawyer listed. Emily had processed hundreds of men in and out of these walls, but something about this one made her pause. He didn't flinch when they took his photo, didn't react to the cold fingerprint scanner. And when she gave him a quick look over checking for weapons or contraband, he held her gaze not aggressively, just steady, observing. She assigned him to C block, a quieter section typically used for short-term holds. It wasn't that he looked dangerous. Quite the opposite. He didn't look like he belonged here at all. No tattoos, no jailhouse energy, no twitchy eyes or slouched shoulders. Just that same steady presence, as if he'd walked into the building with a map already drawn in his mind. By the second day, his routine had formed. He woke early, always before lights on, stretched, did slow, controlled push-ups, read quietly alone for hours at a time. He didn't speak to anyone, not his cellmate, not the guards, not even when handed his food tray. He nodded in acknowledgement but offered no words. A few of the other inmates noticed. One of them, a loud guy from C2, took offense to Malik's silence and tossed a rolled-up sock at him during rec, calling him preacher boy, then mute freak. Malik didn't turn around immediately. He stood still for a beat, then slowly turned and met the man's eyes. No words, no change in posture, just a long, direct look. The guy blinked first, turned away and muttered something under his breath. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something colder, like he'd realized too late that he'd been trying to provoke a man who was playing by different rules. The kind of rules you don't get to learn in a place like this. Emily watched that unfold on the monitor. She leaned in slightly, eyes narrowing, then said nothing. But her curiosity sharpened. He hadn't reacted. He hadn't needed to. On day 4, she found herself pulling his intake file again. Still nothing stood out. No prior arrests, no priors of any kind, no job listed, no emergency contact, just the transcript from the courthouse. Refused to speak. Held in contempt. 30 days. It didn't fit. People get locked up for all sorts of reasons. But silence. That's rare. Silence gets you a warning. Maybe a night. Not a full month. Not unless there's something else underneath it. And it wasn't just the silence. It was the way he moved through the building like he was watching it. Not nervously, methodically. When the lunch schedule ran 10 minutes late, he noticed. When 2 inmates were swapped from D block to A block, he noticed. When one of the ceiling cameras buzzed louder than the others, he looked up for exactly 3 seconds, no more, no less. Emily had been working in this place long enough to know what real danger looks like. It's loud, messy, full of ego and desperation. But Malik Carter didn't come off as dangerous. He came off as deliberate, like he was collecting something. It unnerved her more than she liked to admit. That night, as she walked the final round past C block, she paused near his cell. He was sitting on his cot reading again a book she didn't recognize, some political biography maybe. He didn't look up at first, but then he did. Their eyes met. And for the briefest moment, she felt like she was the one being studied. She walked on. Still no infractions, no notes, no missed head counts, not even a question. But by now, Emily had a question of her own, one she kept returning to as the days ticked by. What kind of man chooses silence in a system that feeds on noise? And more importantly, why does it feel like he's not the one trapped in here? She didn't know the answer, not yet. But she was starting to suspect that whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake. And Malik Carter. He wasn't just waiting out 30 days. He was watching. Calculating, preparing. For what, though, she couldn't say. only that when he moved again, when he finally did speak, it would matter. And something told her the entire system would feel it. It started with a clipboard. Just another shift, another routine check at the records room. Emily wasn't even supposed to be there that morning. She'd stopped by to ask about missing intake photos for another inmate, but something else caught her eye, an open file sitting half-closed on the desk right near the edge. The name printed in sharp black ink across the top was Carter Malik. She didn't move right away, just stared at it for a moment. Carter wasn't exactly a rare name, but it wasn't just the name. It was how it sat on that paper. Quiet. Undisturbed. As if no one had dared ask too much. Her mind jumped before she could help it. Andrew Carter, the governor of Georgia. White. Conservative. Widely respected, publicly guarded. A man known for walking tight political lines. And married, if she remembered right, to a black woman. A woman almost never photographed, barely mentioned. Their family had always been something the press treated like sacred ground, off limits, private. But that name didn't belong in this building. She told herself it was a coincidence. People share names. That doesn't mean anything. And then later that afternoon, as she passed by the communications office, she heard it. A voice, muffled, but clear enough, coming from the half-closed door. Look, just make sure it doesn't leak. Carter's not supposed to be on anyone's radar. If this blows up, we're all in trouble. The words hit her like ice water. She didn't even recognize the voice. Maybe a supervisor, maybe someone from administration, but it didn't matter. The tone said everything. This wasn't routine. This wasn't just another silent inmate. This was someone they were scared people might recognize. By the time she got back to her desk, she was shaking slightly. She pulled up the intake file again, her fingers suddenly less steady. The photo stared back at her, Malik, in the same shirt he'd worn that first day expression, unreadable gaze leveled just slightly above the camera. Nothing on the surface screamed politics or power, but something about the posture. It clicked. She opened her browser and searched quietly, heart beating harder with each word typed. Governor Andrew Carter. Wife, Leanne Carter, née Brooks. Children undisclosed. Media requests for family information declined. No public photos, no birth records released. Then, buried in an old article from 7 years ago, she found it. A blurry photograph taken from a rally. The governor standing off stage. Beside him, a young black man, late teens at the time, in a dark hoodie looking away from the crowd. The resemblance was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't just the shape of the jawline, it was the quiet. She leaned back, mouth dry. The realization wasn't loud. It didn't crash in. It just settled. Slow, heavy. She was looking at the son of the governor of Georgia, and he was in their custody in a low-security rural jail, sentenced by a small-town judge who had no idea who he was. She ran a hand over her face, trying to breathe through it, because the moment she accepted that truth, everything else shifted. His silence, the way he moved, the way he never reacted, not in court, not in the yard. Like he was built to absorb tension without breaking. Like he'd been taught not to let the system feed off his fear. He wasn't just staying quiet. He was holding a mirror. She thought back to the way he'd looked at the other inmate in the yard. Calm, grounded. And suddenly it didn't feel like control anymore. It felt like command, a different kind of training. Not military, not performance. Something deeper. The kind of discipline that comes from knowing your presence alone can say more than any outburst ever could. And now she couldn't stop asking herself the question, was this all an accident? Or had he meant to be here? She didn't dare bring it up to anyone, not yet. But from that moment on, she watched him more closely. Not with suspicion, not even with fear. Just awareness. She noticed how he lingered at the rec yard entrance, not out of hesitation, but as if measuring angles. She noticed how he never looked surprised when head counts shifted or when meal schedules changed. He didn't complain. He didn't need to. Because he already knew. And for the first time in her career, Emily Ward started to feel something she hadn't felt behind these walls in years, unsettled. Not because she feared him, but because she was starting to understand just how much he saw. And how little they understood. This wasn't just a quiet man in a jail cell. This was the beginning of something much, much louder. And she knew sooner or later someone outside these walls would hear it. By the time Malik Carter was brought back into that courtroom, the air had changed. It was still the same wooden benches and the same dusty ceiling fans turning slow above their heads. The seal of Georgia still hung crooked behind the judge's bench, and Judge Harold Brenner still sat there like he owned every breath that passed through the room. But this time, it wasn't just townsfolk in the audience. There were eyes from outside now. A young man with a camera case slung low under his coat. A woman with a press badge clipped to the collar of her cardigan, her pen already poised before the bailiff even finished calling court into session. Local media had caught wind of something unusual, a silent man jailed over contempt, hauled back in over an administrative inconsistency. It was the kind of phrasing that makes journalists sniff for blood. Malik was led in wrists free this time, no chains on his ankles. Still in the same clothes, still walking as if the floor would hold him no matter who tried to pull it out. He sat quietly. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't nod to anyone. He just faced forward, that same unshakable calm that had started to unsettle even the guards escorting him. Brenner cleared his throat too loud, adjusted his robe too many times. Something in his face flickered. Discomfort, maybe. Or worse, doubt. But he covered it quickly with sarcasm. Well, he said, drawing the word out like it tasted sour. Mr. Carter, back so soon. Finally ready to speak. There was a pause. The room held its breath. Then Malik looked up, not rushed, not performative, just steady. And he said clearly and calmly, "You've already said enough for both of us." It wasn't loud. He didn't shout. But the words landed like glass cracking under pressure. The sound didn't echo off the walls, but it echoed in every mind in that room. The young journalist in the back pressed record without blinking. The woman with the notepad stopped writing. Her eyes locked on Malik, like she'd just witnessed something she didn't know how to explain. Brenner shifted in his seat. The flush that rose to his face wasn't from anger this time. It was from exposure, from the quiet sense that something had shifted beneath his feet, and he was the last one to feel it. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then didn't. Instead, he fumbled with the folder in front of him, reading aloud from legal jargon about records, mismatches, and oversight. But the room wasn't listening to that anymore. They were listening to what hadn't been said, what didn't need to be said. Malik had drawn a line, and he hadn't needed more than one sentence to do it. Emily Ward sat in the far corner close to the side wall, her uniform still crisp, but her face tighter than usual. She didn't take her eyes off him. She could see it now, the control, the precision, the restraint that no one else seemed to know how to handle. He wasn't just holding back. He was orchestrating something. And the scary thing, the powerful thing, was that he didn't even have to raise his voice to do it. Outside, a handful of people had begun to gather. A few protesters quiet, holding handwritten signs. No shouting, no megaphones, just presence, just a message. Back inside, the tension simmered. Brenner tried to regain footing, asking procedural questions, redirecting to the clerk, but the courtroom had already shifted in energy. Malik's silence no longer felt like submission. It felt like sovereignty. Every person watching, from the clerk to the old man with the cane in the back row, could feel it. The system had overplayed its hand, and now it was being called out, not with rage, not with noise, but with a mirror held steady in front of its face. As the judge moved to wrap up fumbling again through legal formalities, one of the younger reporters whispered to her colleague beside her. "This isn't about the contempt charge," she said. "It never was," and she was right. Because what everyone felt, what they couldn't name yet but felt deeply, was that the room had just become part of something bigger. The start of something. Or maybe the reckoning of something long overdue. And Malik. He said no more. He stood when the hearing was adjourned, nodded to no one, and walked out with the same slow, deliberate steps. But by then, the ripple had already begun. Someone had finally listened. And from that moment on, no one in that town or beyond would look at silence the same way again. It was never meant to leave the building. That email. That file. The one Emily had flagged and forwarded late that afternoon with a half-finished sentence in the subject line and no explanation in the body. She told herself she was just pushing it up the chain, doing her due diligence, making sure someone with authority would make the right call. She didn't plan for what came next. The file landed in the inbox of a junior clerk named Devin Hughes, A quiet man in his 40s, black, soft-spoken, the kind of employee who knew when to keep his head down. But that day, as he opened the attachment and saw the name Malik Carter beside a state seal, something in him froze. He stared at the intake photo, the court transcripts, the metadata logs, his eyes scanning over phrases like non-compliant contempt of court and no legal counsel present. He didn't forward it. He didn't print it. He copied it on a drive no one could trace, and he sent it to someone who would. The file landed next in the inbox of a woman named Rosa Gilliam, a freelance journalist based in Atlanta. Rosa didn't work for a paper. She worked for the truth. Known for exposing hidden stories that slipped between the cracks of mainstream media, she had sources inside every system that tried to bury the wrong voices. And within an hour of opening the file, she had the confirmation she needed. She cross-referenced the facial structure, the timeline, the public family records, long hidden behind press statements and vague bios. Then she picked up the phone, called a source in the governor's office, and asked just one question. Does the governor have a son named Malik? The silence on the other end was answer enough. By sunset, Rosa had the full story written, but she didn't publish it through a paper. She posted it herself, and within 20 minutes it was everywhere. Silent man in Georgia courtroom confirmed as governor's son. Beneath the headline was a still image pulled from court footage the moment Malik looked up and said, "You've already said enough for both of us." It hit like a thunderclap across Twitter. The hashtag #SilentCarter began trending within the hour, first in Georgia, then across the East Coast, then nationwide. Not through outrage, through precision. Because people didn't just see another black man mistreated in a broken system. They saw intention. They saw restraint. They saw a message. And then came the video. The clip wasn't long, less than 15 seconds. A shaky recording from someone in the courtroom, likely the reporter in the cardigan, capturing the moment Judge Brenner asked if Malik was ready to speak and the exact pause before his reply. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Calm. Direct. As if he'd waited for that very moment to turn the courtroom into a stage. Millions watched it in the first day, tens of millions the next, and something shifted in the streets. In Atlanta, they gathered outside the courthouse. In Macon, they stood outside City Hall, not yelling, not breaking, just standing, holding signs that read, "We don't scream, we expose." In Birmingham, a teacher played the clip for her high school government class and asked, "What is justice supposed to sound like?" In Chicago, an old man who'd marched with King posted a selfie with a sign that read, "He did what we never could. He made silence louder than hate." Even Emily, still inside the system she now questioned, watched it unfold on her phone during her lunch break. She scrolled past retweets, interviews, commentaries, and stopped on one photo. It was a young boy, maybe 12, standing on the front steps of a courthouse holding a handwritten sign that said simply, "My voice is learning. He showed me how." And in that moment she realized what had truly leaked. It wasn't just a name, or a photo, or a file. It was a reckoning. And once it was out, there would be no taking it back. They weren't expecting anyone new that day. The courtroom had filled just like it had the last time, tightly packed rows, local press squeezed against the side walls, murmurs humming just beneath the judge's voice. Brenner was back behind the bench, a little less smug, a little more guarded. The air still held a charge from the viral storm outside, but inside they tried to keep the rules intact, at least on the surface. Malik sat the way he always had. Still, composed, unshaken. The room watched him more closely now, like he was no longer a man on trial but something bigger, maybe a symbol, maybe a storm waiting for its second wave. And then in the middle of a procedural statement, right when Brenner was repeating some line about court decorum and due process, the door in the back of the courtroom opened. No bailiff announced him. No security cleared a path. No cameras followed him in. It was just a man in a dark gray suit walking quietly, steadily between the rows of wooden benches. Some people turned their heads slowly, unsure whether to react. Some didn't even recognize him at first. But a few did, and they stiffened like the air had turned cold. Governor Andrew Carter. He wasn't surrounded by aides. He wasn't carrying papers or stepping onto a podium. He didn't walk like a politician that day. He walked like a father. Malik didn't turn to look. The governor walked straight to the railing at the front, just inside the courtroom's threshold, and stopped. He didn't ask permission to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked directly at Judge Brenner and said, "He told me not to come." I respected that, but I've watched enough. Brenner froze, mouth half open. The words he was about to say caught like splinters in his throat. No one in that room had ever seen him hesitate, not once in all his years on that bench. But in that moment he looked suddenly smaller, not just older, smaller. The governor's voice, it didn't rise. It didn't need to. He said, "You've built a courtroom around your voice, around the sound of power, the echo of judgment. But let me tell you something." And then he looked over, not at the press, not at the people, but at Malik, quietly, proudly. He turned back to the judge and said, "He didn't speak, because he knew you would." There was no clapping, no gasps, just a stillness. Heavy, complete. Even those who didn't understand the full weight of what had just been said could feel that it mattered. Deeply. Brenner, for the first time since Malik Carter had walked into his courtroom, didn't know what to do next. His gavel sat untouched. His notes in front of him suddenly felt irrelevant. He reached for them anyway, the way a drowning man reaches for a rope he knows won't hold. The governor didn't stay long. He didn't grandstand. He didn't challenge the sentence or demand release. He simply looked once more at his son, nodded slightly as if in agreement, more than farewell, and turned to leave. As he passed the rows of wooden benches, the silence deepened, stretched. People shifted, uncertain of whether to stand or stay seated. No one moved, not even the bailiff. Outside, the news trucks had just begun to gather. They didn't know yet what had happened inside, but they would. And when they did, it wouldn't just be about a man wrongfully jailed. It would be about a system that had silenced itself in front of everyone. Inside that courtroom, you could feel it. That strange, slow realization creeping into people's bones. They hadn't just underestimated a man. They had touched the one man who chose silence over spectacle, who'd weaponized restraint and patience in a world addicted to noise. And now the most powerful man in the state had shown up not to fight for his son, but to prove that his son never needed to fight at all. The punishment wasn't in the handcuffs. It wasn't in the jail time. It wasn't even in the judge's mistake. The punishment was that Malik Carter never had to raise his voice to undo the courtroom built to silence him. He just had to sit still long enough for everyone else to hear the echo. And in that quiet, something inside Judge Brenner finally cracked, not with a bang, but a shift. Like a mirror finally forced to look at itself. At first, it was just whispers. Quiet questions asked in courthouse hallways, in late-night newsroom meetings, in circles of legal interns reading case files that suddenly felt heavier. People started looking again at transcripts, at audio recordings, at patterns. Patterns that once seen couldn't be unseen. Judge Harold Brenner had ruled on over 2,000 cases during his years on the bench. And in the days after the governor's visit, a small group of law students at Emory decided to pull those rulings just to see. Just to check. What they found wasn't a smoking gun. It was something colder, quieter. Case after case, the outcomes leaned subtly, persistently against black defendants. Shorter testimonies accepted, longer sentences issued, harsher language recorded in the margins. Soon it wasn't just students, it was former attorneys, retired clerks, and then reporters. Headlines didn't scream, but they multiplied. Judge under scrutiny for racial disparities. Dozens of old cases resurface amid silence controversy. One paper called it Justice in Rewind. Another simply said the Carter Effect. And all the while, Malik Carter still hadn't spoken again. But others had. Sergeant Emily Ward submitted her resignation. Not in protest, but in purpose. Her letter, later published online, was brief but brutal. She wrote, "Some systems aren't broken. They're built that way. And when someone refuses to play along the cracks show, I saw the cracks. I can't ignore them anymore." She ended her letter by requesting a federal inquiry into the handling of detainees in the county jail system. Her words joined a growing current. A protest began outside the courthouse, not loud, not violent, but unwavering. People held signs with only one sentence. Silent doesn't mean weak. No chants, no speeches, just stillness, day after day. Some stood in the rain. Some brought chairs for the elderly. Some came at lunch breaks just to be present. By the end of the week, the protest had reached 5 other cities, then 10, then 27. It was never led by one person. No one held a megaphone. No one needed to. The story carried itself now. People knew it by heart. Malik's one line from court, "You've already said enough for both of us," was quoted in editorials printed on posters, spoken in sermons. But it was what he said later once in a brief comment to a prison chaplain that became legend. The chaplain had asked him how he felt being at the center of all this. Malik didn't answer right away. He looked out the window for a moment, then said quietly, "My silence was the mirror. You broke yourself against it." Those words spread like wildfire. Within hours, they became the closing line in think pieces, the opening line in college lectures, the caption under black and white images of his face. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every courtroom where someone had stayed quiet, because they knew their words would be twisted. Every jail cell where someone sat alone because no one thought they mattered. Every judge's gavel that had fallen with certainty but without justice. And now the system was looking in the mirror. Judicial review boards reopened old cases. One by one, appeals were granted for people who'd spent years behind bars on shaky grounds. A defense fund started in Malik's name received more donations than anyone expected. But Malik refused to attach his face to it. He said nothing. He just let it work. In interviews, people called him a symbol, a mystery, a message. But the ones who had met him, who had seen the way he sat still in that courtroom, the way he looked at Brenner without blinking, they said something else. They said he wasn't a symbol. He was the consequence. And it was the system that had summoned him. One retired judge in a private panel discussion said it best. He didn't try to tear the walls down. He just waited long enough for them to collapse. By the time Judge Brenner was placed under formal review, no one was surprised. Not even his supporters. What stunned them was how fast it happened, how seamlessly the machinery turned inward once someone refused to feed it. The silence hadn't just echoed, it had pierced. And even now, as people talked, marched, posted, argued, apologized, Malik Carter remained quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because somewhere deep down the country was finally listening, and the man who had once been handcuffed at a bus stop was still sitting calmly letting the noise catch up to the truth that had always been there, waiting. When Malik Carter walked out of the courthouse, there were cameras, of course. Reporters lined the sidewalk, their questions already sharpened, their microphones raised like weapons cloaked in curiosity. But Malik didn't stop. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. He simply kept walking, flanked by no one, his steps as measured as they had been the day he was led in wearing cuffs. The cameras followed, hoping for a glance, a gesture, any word at all. But Malik didn't look back. By the time they realized he wasn't going to speak, he had already turned the corner. And when he disappeared into the black car waiting at the end of the street, there was a hush, oddly appropriate. They had followed him all the way here for a statement, and somehow his silence was the loudest thing they recorded. He didn't return to the Capitol, not to any press event or televised forum. Instead, he drove hours south, far from the buzz and the headlines, to a town so small it barely made the map. It was where his mother had grown up, a place of soft fields, slow time, and long silences. The kind of place where children played under pecan trees and elders sat on porch swings counting memories instead of days. There he stayed, not hidden, just home. The people in that town didn't ask many questions. They had all lived lives full of the kind of knowledge that doesn't need to be spoken. They welcomed him with nods, with hands on shoulders, with food left quietly on his porch. They had known silence for generations. They knew how it held pain, how it carried love, how it remembered. It was on a Sunday afternoon, weeks after the storm had passed, that Emily Ward no longer, Sergeant, no longer in uniform, came to visit. She wore simple clothes, nothing that marked her as who she had once been. She brought a book, some mail, and a quiet respect that hadn't left her since the courtroom. They sat outside under the shade of an old sycamore tree, watching the children play in the dusty yard. One of those children, a black boy no older than 7, wandered over, holding a stick like a sword, eyes wide with curiosity. He looked up at Emily, then back toward the house where Malik had gone inside for a moment. "Is he a superhero?" the boy asked, voice soft, unsure if he was allowed to ask such a thing. Emily looked at him, the corners of her mouth folding into a quiet smile. She glanced at the door, then down at the boy's dusty shoes. "No," she said gently. "He's a consequence." The boy blinked, not quite understanding but sensing that the answer mattered. He nodded anyway, then ran off to rejoin the others. Later, as the sun began to melt into the horizon, casting long gold shadows across the ground, Emily stood to leave. She paused once at the porch, looked back, and then drove away in silence. And so it ended. Not with sirens or speeches, not with fists raised or verdicts overturned, but with stillness. With a man who never shouted but was heard across a nation. With a courtroom that thought it was punishing silence and ended up being judged by it. People would go on to write books about what happened. Documentaries would be made. Students would quote his words in essays and rallies. But none of them would quite capture the feeling in that town on that porch, in that breath between two people who had seen something shift in the bones of justice itself. He never raised his voice, but the whole world heard him. Some stories shout, others whisper. But the ones that stay with us are the ones that make us feel. Malik Carter never raised his voice, yet somehow he held a mirror to an entire system. His silence didn't mean weakness. It meant control, purpose, power. And when the truth came out, it wasn't loud, it was undeniable. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who still believes in justice, and hit subscribe to follow Mr. Mac's Stories, where we tell the stories that others overlook, the ones that leave a mark. Your support means the world to our team. It gives us the strength to keep creating meaningful content stories that echo long after they're told. Thank you for being here. Let's keep listening.